All right, everyone. Welcome to podcast number 7. But before we get started, just to give you guys a quick insight here. Normally when I do podcasts, I do like 3, maybe 4 takes max. And anyone the few people I've heard, listened to like rough copies, they'd hear like take 1 and take 2. And it's pretty much literally word for word. And none of my podcasts are scripted ever. It's all just right from my head. And you're always like, how do you do that? Well, that's what being a genius is all about. That being said, this current podcast has been a long time coming. Since I started doing podcasts, this is the longest gap I've had in between of a podcast. There's like a 3 or 4 week period when I was working on this podcast. Whenever I had free time, I've been a little bit busy, I'd work on this podcast. Then I stopped working on this, let it go for another 3 or 4 weeks. Then I came back to it for a couple weeks, stopped working on it, started working on it again, and now it brings us back to right now. So hopefully this is the last time to do this podcast. Again, it's been a long, long time coming, but it brings us to this podcast, podcast number 7, which is going to be about the Mongols. This podcast, the reason why we're doing this podcast is because last podcast we were talking about the history of rule, aka different forms of government. And one of the systems I talked about was the tribal system, and how a lot of people from the scholarly background, or even from a modern perspective, look back at the tribal system as being one of the best ways that humans can interact, both with each other and also with nature. But a lot of people also say that that system is really only good for small scale, or it doesn't really fit into the modern world. And, one people who totally turned that notion up inside of its head was a tribal people, the Mongols, who conquered the largest empire in human history. And they were tribal peoples. Now, technically, the British had the largest empire of all time, but I think that's a bunch of bullshit, because the British Empire was basically an empire of economic control, and it had a lot of puppet governments and stuff like that. So I consider the Mongols to be the true largest empire in human history. And I also consider the Mongols to be the greatest empire in human history, period, as well. Now, people who know me know I've been studying history for a very, very long time. And I've always been ahead, if I can say that humbly here. Kind of hard to say that humbly, but when I was in grade school, I was studying high school level stuff. When I was in high school, I was studying college level stuff. And when I was in college, I knew shit my professors didn't know. And I hear a lot of people who say that kind of stuff that are kind of full of shit, but those who know me know I'm not full of shit here. I've been studying history for a very, very, very long time. All the great empires, the Romans, Turks, whatever. And I say the Mongols are the greatest empire in the history of mankind. And we're going to go over all this, but most people, again, know little or nothing about the Mongols. And it boggles my mind. And most people who do know anything about the Mongols are people who come from a military history background. Because you cannot deny the efficiency of the Mongol militaries. Greatest military ever. They conquered the largest empire in history. How did they do it? But we're going to go over all this. But first, there's all these stereotypical images of the Mongols. Again, people don't know much about them. And those who do view them as this wild barbarian horde. There's been many TV shows about the Mongols. Again, most of it's from a military background. There was that TV show, Deadliest Warrior. Who would win, the Mongols or the Comanches, was one episode I remember. And it was like, the way the Mongols are being portrayed is like this imperial army. A lot of infantry and matching armor and all that kind of crap. And it was more of a Chinese style. Now, that might be true later on when Kublai Khan was in power. But really, again, the Mongols were tribal peoples. And that's why we're talking about them in this podcast. So, with that, though, the stereotypical image of the Mongols is also they're wild barbarians. Another TV show is literally called Barbarians. We're talking about people like the Huns and the Goths, And there's another TV show about Genghis Khan. It's called Ancients Behaving Badly. So there's all these images of the Mongols. Even the name for the military. If you look at different, the Roman legions, for example, or the samurai of Japan, where the Mongols have the Mongol horde. And when you hear that word horde, the images it kind of puts in your mind is this vast army, hundreds of thousands of strong warriors who just completely overwhelm their enemies like locusts with sheer numbers. They'd go into cities and towns. They would burn everything down, kill everyone inside, murder men, women, children. Images of Genghis Khan that people have is that he was this big pimp daddy who would go around raping bitches and getting more women to screw. And there's some modern evidence we have that like 1 out of 4 people are related to Genghis Khan. Also, there's a quote from Genghis Khan himself, paraphrasing, the greatest pleasure in life is to destroy your enemies and take their women to your chest and stuff like that. So there's all these images of the Mongols, wild, murderous barbarians. destroyers of civilization. And yet the reality is the Mongols are one of the driving factors for the world advancing into the modern era. And nobody knows about it. And this is why we're going to be discussing all this podcast. But of course, if we're talking about the Mongols, you have to start with the con man, Genghis Khan. And I was in a college class one time that was strictly about the history of the British Isles. And we're going over all like the British monarchs and stuff like that, and all their sexual intrigues and intrigues in general. You know, look at Henry VIII, for example, who broke from the Catholic Church for no other reason than he was a lecherous fuck and wanted to divorce his wife, and the church wouldn't let him. So, you know, he was going over the history of the British Isles and all these horribly incompetent leaders. And I was in class one day praising Genghis Khan as being like the greatest leader ever. And some girl turned around and she's like, "Oh my God, isn't Genghis Khan like the Adolf Hitler of the medieval world?" And all I could think in my mind was, "Oh my God, you silly bitch, you." But really, could I blame this girl? Because this is, again, the image that most people have of the Mongols. I have a quote here. I have some quotes I had to write down so I remember the quotes. Like I said, I do all these podcasts from my mind, but some of these quotes and stuff I wrote down. There's a quote here from a man named Voltaire. He was a French statesman and philosopher. Some of you may not know him as much if you don't study that. That's okay. But he has a quote here about the Mongols. And this kind of might go with the image that people have of the Mongols. He's describing Genghis Khan as the king of kings, the fiery Genghis Khan, who lays the fertile fields of Asia waste. He is a wild Scythian soldier bred to arms and practiced in the trade of blood. And Voltaire's, he calls them wild sons of rapine who live in tents, in chariots, and in the fields. They detest our arts, our customs, and our laws, and therefore mean to change them all, to make this splendid seat of empire one vast desert like their own. So again, those images people have the Mongols being wild, killing barbarians, destroying everything, kind of reiterated there by Voltaire. But the kicker about this quote is, this quote was written by Voltaire hundreds and hundreds of years after the Mongols were around. I also have another quote here about the con man Genghis Khan. Many of you may not have known who Voltaire is, or maybe at least heard his name. But here's someone you may have heard of, I hope, Geoffrey Chaucer. Maybe you've heard of the Canterbury Tales, the Knight's Tale. They made a movie about that with Heath Ledger many years back. Pretty sure most of you have heard of Geoffrey Chaucer. Here's what Geoffrey Chaucer has to say about Genghis Khan. Real quick before I read this quote also, he was also around again, closer to the time of Genghis Khan. Here's what Geoffrey Chaucer has to say. "This noble king was called Genghis Khan, who in his time was of great renown, that there was nowhere in no region so excellent a lord in all things. He lacked nothing that belonged to a king. As of the sect of which he was born, he kept his law, to which that he was sworn. And thereto he was hardy, wise, and rich, and piteous, and just, always liked, sooth of his word, benign, honorable, of his courage as any center stable, young, fresh, and strong, in arms desirous, as any bachelor of all his house. A fair person he was, and fortunate, and kept always so well a royal estate, that there was nowhere such another man. This noble king, the Tartar, Genghis Khan." So again, that quote right there is from Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey fucking Chaucer saying that Genghis Khan is the greatest leader in the world. Whoa! Did you know Geoffrey Chaucer wrote about the Mongols? Probably not. But, so there you go. How do you go from those images that a lot of people have of Mongols being wild, murderous barbarians to Geoffrey Chaucer saying Genghis Khan is the greatest leader in the world? We're going to start back at the beginning. This first part of the Mongol podcast is going to mainly focus on the con man himself, Genghis Khan. But before we get into that, we'll give you a quick background of the world at the time of the Mongols. First, south of Mongolia, you had, of course, China. Probably the most advanced culture in the world at the time, way ahead of everyone else. But at this time, China has gone through many, many periods of wars, different dynasties rolling. It's never really unified as a whole country. And at this time, it's split apart too, because for many hundreds of years, tribal peoples have come from the area that we would consider Mongolia and maybe a little bit further west, Central Asia. Nomadic tribes have come in raiding for many years. And at this time, one of these people was the people called the Jin, or the Jurchen, the Jurchen tribe. And they had conquered all of northern China, and they had a mix of cultures, pretty much. If you can think of it from a Western standard, how the Vikings conquered large parts of Europe, and when the Vikings settled down with people in France, for example, the Vikings were known as Normans, which was an offshoot of Northmen. If you're not familiar with this, many of you might be already. And when they conquered part of France, they became known as Normandy, or land of the Norsemen. And when the Vikings settled down with people, they pretty much took on their habits, maybe lost some of their barbacity, if you want to say that. Is that even a word? I don't know. But anyway, so the same thing here could be said with nomadic tribes. And at this time, nomadic tribes had years previously come from the area of maybe around Mongolia and conquered all of northern China. And they set up this thing called the Jin dynasty. Southern part of China, which was what we would consider the more traditional Chinese culture, was ruled by the Song dynasty at this time. And these people had sort of a rivalry. Okay, you go further west, you start getting into more Central Asia. Again, there's many tribal or steppe tribal peoples in this area, nomadic peoples. But right around the area of modern day, you could say Iran, Afghanistan, a lot of the stands, part of Kazakhstan, Turkestan, all these stands we have today, was an empire known as the Khwarezm Empire. And I'm willing to bet that most of you listening right now have never even heard of the Khwarezm Empire before. But at this time, they're one of the wealthiest places in the entire world. There's another TV show we can reference here. Is a show called Mankind, the Story of Us. We can talk about this with the Mongols a little bit later in this podcast. This podcast was about the history of mankind all the way from our primitive beginnings as cavemen up into the modern era, citing all the major events in human history. And I was pleasantly surprised with this TV show because they actually gave a huge portion about the Mongols, but most of it focused on their conquest and nothing else. Again, most people know about the Mongols know simply about their conquest and are portrayed as murderous barbarians. But what the show does is it talks about the Mongols, and it goes right into the Mongol Empire falling apart and saying, and now we're in the modern world, without bridging the gap at all of how we went from the Mongols to the modern world, without attributing the fact that it was the Mongols who were the sole reason for this, as I said earlier. But we'll save that again for the second half of this podcast. But anyway, why I'm mentioning the show here is because this show also talks about this thing called the Silk Road. And if you're not familiar with the Silk Road, it's a series of established trade routes from China going all the way towards the Mediterranean Sea. And this show talks about the Silk Road being established back in Roman times, and it's sort of making it like the Romans were the ones responsible for this, and that it's complete and utter bullshit. Trade did go from Europe to China, but it was very small. If you have to give a metaphor, it's almost like if you had a faucet of water that was clogged, and it's like a drip, small drip, very insignificant. Most trade from China stopped in the Middle East, and most trade from Europe stopped in the Middle East as well. Goods would flow through back and forth, but it really, it's kind of maybe it's inaccurate to say that no one ever traveled from Europe to China, but historically there's no documented evidence of it before the Mongol Empire. So historically you can say no one traveled, but that's probably not true. But really, people from Europe and Asia did not interact much at all. Semi-mythical ideas about each other. So all trade would come into the Middle East, and it would all stop in the Khwarezm Empire, one of the wealthiest empires at the time. Okay, so moving along further west, sorry I kind of spent too much time with the Khwarezm Empire there, but very wealthy. Further west, you have the Islamic empires, and a lot of times, we look at the Islamic world today as being backwards and terrorists and all this crap. But the reality is, a lot of people don't realize the Islamic Empire at one time was one of the most advanced civilizations in the world. I don't think they were as advanced as the Chinese, but they were very advanced. Had huge gains in astronomy and math. If people really want to hate Islam, that's why you should hate them. Algebra. Can all thank that to the Muslims. Damn Muslims bring the algebra. I mean, some people actually like math. I'm not one of them. Fuck math. If you ever hated math in school or you've ever hated algebra, there you go. There's a reason you should really hate the terrorist. But anyway, so the Islamic powers were very strong. But they were split apart. You have the Caliphate in Baghdad, Damascus. Very strong. I forget which Caliphate was out at this time. You had the Umayyads and Abbasids. I forget which one was in power. But anyway, And you go into the Egypt area, you also have the Mamelukes, another Islamic faction. At this time, you have the Crusaders in the Middle East. Crusaders had conquered the Holy Land, but at this time, speaking of the Mamelukes, they had a leader named Salahuddin. In my opinion, one of the greatest Islamic leaders of all time. He was absolutely beating the shit out of the Crusaders, pretty much kicking them out of the Holy Land this time. And you go into further north, you have the Byzantine Empire, the last remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire. A lot of people thought Rome fell. You know, when the Roman Empire fell, it's not true. Those who know history know the Byzantine Empire, a.k.a. the Eastern Romans, lasted for many, many years. Still around this time, not very too strong. They have Constantinople. And you go further north into Europe, you have Russia. Russia at this time is not a united country. It is, divided between a bunch of principalities that were, I think, had some Viking backgrounds as well. The major cities, Novgorod. What was the other one? I forget off the top of my head. My goodness. Kiev, there you go. Kiev, Novgorod. Russia had experienced many, many incursions, again, from people from the Mongolian area. Looking back at history, even going back to Roman times, you had the Huns, you had the Avars, Bulgars, Scythians, Sarmatians. There's all these nomadic peoples that have swayed into Europe, just like we were just talking about China earlier, from the Central Asian or nomadic area of Mongolia. Many, many hundreds of years, tribal people constantly flowing through. So at this time, the Russians had their principalities, but also next to them you had people called the Cumans, or Kichpak Turks, another nomadic people. You go into Europe itself, Europe was, compared to China and the Islamic empires, Europe was completely backwards at this time. Europeans like to have a high opinion of themselves, but at this time they were nowhere near, again, Islam or the Chinese cultures. And that is a brief overview of the world of Eurasia anyway, at the time of the Mongols. That brings us into the Mongolian steppes themselves. Now, for people who don't really know much about the Mongols, again, sometimes they're portrayed as this imperial people, but the reality was they were really a tribal, nomadic people. And there's a metaphor I give a lot of people who don't really know much about them. If you take Native American Indians, and again, if you don't know anything about Native American history, which a lot of people don't, there were thousands and thousands of different Native American tribes in America before the Europeans came over. But if you take the archetype we have of the East Woodlands tribes, which is people on the East Coast, people encountered by British Anglo-type colonists, take those Indians. You combine them with Plains Indians from western, the middle of the United States. You combine these two Indians. You then take this Native American amalgam and mix it with the samurai from Japan. That's what you would get if you had to talk about the Mongols. A tribal people who are also very militaristic. And again, since nomadic people had been invading China for many, many years, the Chinese used tactics that the Romans had used, divide and conquer. They were constantly playing one tribe against the other tribe. Now, people in Mongolia were not very, first of all, let's talk about Mongolia itself, the geography of Mongolia. Mongolia is one of the harshest environments in the world to live. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's not a small country, compared to like United States or China today. It might be, not a large country, but it's not a small country by any stretch of the means. But maybe it's like a mid-sized country. But comparatively speaking, again, compared to the United States, you would say it would be a small country maybe now. But for being a maybe small country, if you want to say it in that terms, it has some of the most diverse, geography in the world. South of the country is the Gobi Desert. It's a fucking desert. I shouldn't have to elaborate on with you guys why it's hard to survive in a desert. Most of the country is vast steppes, which is plains of grass, hills and hills of grass. But the thing is, it gets very, very cold in wintertime. There's not very much soil for agriculture at all. In fact, they don't farm or anything like that. The way the people of the Mongolian steppe made their living was through dairy products, through animals. They would herd horses, they would herd sheep, goats, yaks. They'd produce cheese, meats, wool, furs. Speaking of furs, further north in the country, far north, outside the Mongolian border, modern Mongolia border anyway, you get more like in a Siberian type weather and area like that. And sometimes people would go there and hunt exotic animal furs, and they'd go and sell that or trade with Chinese cultures for metals and silks and things that the Mongols did not produce themselves. So extremely harsh environment. Not many natural resources. And people, again, the Chinese would play one tribe against the other. What you saw in the Mongolian steppes at this time was constant warfare. One tribe would attack another tribe. They'd have a blood feud. They'd come back years later, and if they got strong enough, they'd counterattack. They'd steal their, sometimes they'd steal women, sometimes they'd steal goods. And this is the world that Genghis Khan would grow up in. But that was not what he was known as at first. His father was a man named Yasuji. And going in with this constant cycle of warfare, his father was out in a raid one time and kidnapped his mother, Holan. Now, when his father kidnapped his mother, she got pregnant very quickly. So it was always a question of whether she got pregnant from Yasuji or the man he kidnapped her from. He kidnapped her from the Merkit tribe. So anyway, skipping ahead here, going along with the story, we'll try going through this relatively quickly. I gave you guys a lot of background there, but now we're going to get into the background of Genghis Khan. When his father kidnapped his mother, she gave birth, and at the time his father Yasuji was away fighting another tribal leader, and he was so impressed with this man's courage in the battlefield that when he came back to the tent, he named his son Temujin after this man he just defeated. So that was what Genghis Khan's original name was Temujin. And of course, there's myths about his birth that when he was born, he was clutching a clot of blood in his hand that was supposed to represent the bloody lifestyle he would lead when he got older. Who knows if that's true or not. But anyway, so that's how he got his name, Temujin, from the general his father had defeated. Now we're going to skip ahead here. Maybe when Temujin was about 8 years old or so, as tradition had it, his father took him to another tribe to get a wife. And he met this girl named Borte. And I guess Temujin was immediately smitten with this girl. He fell in love with her as a small child, but I guess part of the thing was when you had an arranged marriage, you didn't marry the girl right away. He was supposed to come back for her, sometime later. But shortly after this, I don't know if it was when his father was coming back from this or some other time shortly after, but his father met people on the road. And as we're going over the background of Temujin here, of Genghis Khan, the reason why I'm doing this is because if I said the Mongol Empire was the greatest empire of all time, why is that? There's some key root ideas within the Mongols that we're going to talk about here that will resonate through their empire and what made them great. And one of the things was this adherence to culture or traditional ideas, traditional values. Temujin's father, Yasuji's on the road, and he meets people from the Tartar tribe on the road. Now, tradition held that if you met someone on the road, you had to offer them food or drink. And he was probably there with a bunch of his friends saying, hey, that's our enemies. They might poison it. You can't take food from them. But his father said, no, it is our tradition to do this. We have to keep with our traditions. And as the story goes, of course, the food or the drink, whatever he received from the Tartar people on the road, was indeed poison. So Temujin's father is poisoned. When he goes back to his tribe, long story short, not going into all the details here, his tribe abandons them. Now, Temujin's mother, very, very strong figure in his life. The tribe's trying to abandon him. She gets on a horse, the story says. She rushes after everyone, screaming, yelling, abandon us, And some people stay, but, compelled by her words, screaming at them, you can't leave us, my husband was the leader of the tribe. But again, and in this cycle of constant warfare, you can't have a child being the ruler of a tribe. And not only that, but again, of course, there's always the question, was Temujin Yasuji's father, or was he the father of this other man from another tribe? Was he a bastard child? Another reason why people left. So his mother gets on this horse with her husband's banner. She rides, and a lot of people stop. But that night, when everyone's sleeping, those same people slip away, and the mother's not paying attention. So now Temujin is abandoned on, again, some of the harshest environments in the world, Mongolian steppe. He's abandoned with his mother, and also his father had another wife. So he has some stepchildren. Maybe his mother, some stepchildren, a grandmother. There's some women with him. I'm not going to go into details here like I could. We'll skip over this. The fact of the matter is, basically, they were left to die. But they do wind up surviving. There's a famous story here about I guess Temujin's mother trying to get some legitimacy back to herself. You couldn't be a single woman; you had to have a husband. So one of these stepchildren's name was Bektor. Bektor was stepbrother of Temujin, but the stories goes that he bullied Temujin a lot. Temujin did not like him, and the mother trying to get some legitimacy was said maybe she was going to marry Bektor. So one day Temujin's out hunting for his family, and the story goes they must have killed something, and Bektor took the food for himself and was not going to share it with the rest of the family. And he was a bigger boy than Temujin. He used to pick on him and beat him up. So Temujin sneaks up on him with his real brother, Caesar, and they shoot him in the back and kill him. So this is a really interesting, I'm not really going to go into the psychology of Genghis Khan here, but from a young age, perhaps he couldn't really be dominated by anybody else. He murders his stepbrother. His mother starts wailing, how can we have nothing, we have the small group, we need each other. But anyway, skipping over details here, I'm just going to go into the important events of Temujin's life. After this, he's hunted down by people from, not sure what tribe, it could have been the Taichuts. And they hunt him down on the pretext of murdering the other boy. But really, maybe they really hunted him down because maybe they feared that one day this child would come back for revenge or try getting his tribe back or whatever. But again, one of the key things about Mongolian peoples is their adherence to culture or tradition. Excuse me. One of the traditions was you could not murder the child smaller or shorter than the wheel of a wagon. And again, the Mongolians were nomadic peoples. They lived in these things called yurts, which was big round tents. Sometimes these yurts would be on these big platforms that would be pulled by oxen, maybe like a primitive version of a mobile, or not a mobile home, of an RV or something like that. You just kind of ride around in your own house kind of thing. But anyway, so they can't kill him. They tie him to a wheel. They put this thing around his neck. I forget what it's called, but if you ever seen those old medieval torture devices where you stick your arms and head through, it's pretty similar to that, except this device is clamped to your neck. So this is the background of Temujin. His father's murdered. He kills his brother. He's made a prisoner. He's made a slave. Now, as the story goes, some family takes pity on him and releases him. He goes running off into the wild, again surviving the harshest environment by himself now. Eventually, he does find his family and stuff like that. But another key detail here, just to add important figures here, is somewhere along this time when he's off, he meets another boy named Jamuka. And Jamuka is also, I guess, like Temujin was before his father was killed. Like, his father is a tribal leader. So Jamuka is destined to become a powerful tribal leader. But the thing about this is when these two boys meet, they form this thing called Anda. So Temujin becomes best friends with this kid named Jamuka. And what Anda means is literally, it means blood brothers. I don't know if they actually cut each other's hands open and shook on it or what, but they became the best of friends. As one of the most sacred oaths you can take amongst tribal peoples is this thing called Anda. And him and Jamuka become Anda. But we'll keep that aside for a second. So yeah, Temujin again, he gets free. He probably gets back together with his family. And one of the things he does is he goes and finds the girl he was in love with. He finds Borte. So he finds Borte as part of the wedding dowry. He's given this sable coat, which again, exotic furs worth lots. It's worth lots of money. He goes back living with his mother, his brothers, and stuff like that. And somewhere at this time, Borte is kidnapped. She's kidnapped from a man from the Merkit tribe. Now, I don't know if I did say this in the beginning when I was talking about Mongolia, but was split between dozens and dozens of tribes. I already told you they were tribal peoples, but I was giving you background of the world at the time. I don't think I mentioned yet that Mongolia itself at this time was filled with dozens of different tribes. Okay, again, I was talking about the constant cycle warfare, but the Merkit tribe was a tribe that Temujin's father Yasuji stole his mother from. So a man waited all these years for revenge. Again, I told you about these blood feuds. He comes back seeking revenge on Temujin's father, and he comes and steals his wife. So now, but Temujin, again, he's got this small family unit, but he's not strong at all. So what he does is he goes and he seeks out this man named Togrul. Now, Togrul is also known in history as the Ang Khan. Again, I told you the Chinese always played one tribe off against the other. Perhaps this was a Chinese title given to him by the Chinese. But anyway, Togrul, it's interesting because I told you earlier that Temujin formed an Anda with Jamuka. Togrul was actually his father Yasuji's Anda. So when Temujin went to seek out Togrul, he did this for two reasons. One, because he was his father's Anda, but also because he was a strong tribal leader himself. He was leader of this tribe called the Karate tribe. So Temujin goes, he takes the sable coat, that was worth lots of money. He goes to the Ankang Togrul, and he says, "You are my father's Anda, I pledge my allegiance to you." Also important to note at this time was another vassal, if you want to say that, of Togrul was Temujin's friend Jamuka. So now they form an alliance. Temujin, Jamuka, and Togrul. And they agree to go fight the Merkit tribe. Now, it's a very interesting thing to note here. This is a key moment in the history of the world because of the history of who would become Genghis Khan here. Temujin, his rise to power, literally was to get his wife back. It's literally a love story. Can you imagine that fucking shit? Genghis Khan the musical. How romantic. Musical and nice, you know? But literally, that sounds ridiculous, and yet that is the absolute truth. Genghis Khan's rise to power was because of love, period. I mean, it's something like, again, this images you have of Genghis Khan being this rapist, murderous, pillager, going around killing, stealing women and stuff like that, might not be so true. We'll get into that later. True love is what made him rise to power. Very interesting. And for someone like me who's a hopeless romantic, it's a good story. But anyway, so they go and they attack the Merkits. They destroy the Merkits. And there's some details of the story I can tell, but I'm not going to. But after they defeat the Merkits, Temujin rides into the Merkit camp, and at this time, Borte is actually hiding because she was just kidnapped from Temujin, and now here's another people coming and raiding. She didn't know that it was Temujin coming to rescue her. She just thought it was another, someone else trying to kidnap her, and she didn't want to be kidnapped a second time. But Temujin rides through he's riding through the enemy camp, yelling, "Borte, Borte, Borte," yelling for his wife. They reunite, happy ending, But there is a kicker here. When Temujin finds Borte, she is pregnant. Ring a bell? Just as it was unknown if Temujin was Yasuji's son, this child, was it Temujin's son? Or was it the son of the Merkit man who kidnapped Borte? No one ever knew for sure, but the one thing that we do know is that Temujin always accepted this son. It was a son. He accepted this child as his own child. But very interesting as well here is he names his kid Jochi, which literally in Mongolian translates to visitor. So he always loved and accepted Jochi as his son, but it means visitor. So very, very interesting here. All right. Another very, very key thing here, a history-changing thing here, is what Temujin does after this battle. Because it was traditional that, you conquer an enemy, you get spoils of war, right? Now, another thing I was talking about last podcast that kind of ties in this was when we were talking about different histories of rule, I said that no matter what history of rule you have, I talked about oligarchs, a.k.a. the rich cocksuckers, like I like to call them. And even though I said that the Mongol tribes were tribal people, they also definitely had some element of feudalism in there as well. Because certain tribal leaders were more wealthy than others. Certain tribes or people came from a certain family name, if you want to say that, and they were considered better than other people. So, of course, in this situation, you have Jamuka and Togrul. Togrul is pretty much the overlord of Temujin and Jamuka at this point. And because of that, he gets the greater spoils of war and stuff like that. But Jamuka came from this tribe, if you want to call it of an oligarchic or an aristocracy, if you want to call it that. Last podcast, I made a point to establish a difference between aristocracy and oligarchy. But since in our modern minds, people don't say oligarchy, they confuse it with aristocracy. I'll use that term here. But Jamuka was from a rich family background, so he's used to this. He's used to being privileged, basically, if you want to say that. But so after the battle, Jamuka gets his shares. Of course, he gets all the spoils. Togrul gets all his spoils. But Temujin does something here that will change everything. A complete game changer. Again, I told you, his whole purpose in this expedition of crushing the Merkit tribe was to get his love back, Borte. He didn't care about the material value of this. Over time, this might change. He might realize that, his original goal ultimately was to protect his family, Temujin. That's all he cared about. But over time, he might have realized, in this harsh environment, you need power, you need some kind of strength to be able to support his family. But what he does after the battle is this. He takes his spoils of war and divides it between all of his men. Now, this is something completely unheard of. Again, Jamuka came from an aristocratic background, if you want to say that. He was a wealthy tribesman. He took all the spoils for himself, just like Tokul did. But Temujin does not do that. He shares all the spoils with his men. Now, this can bring us into like a modern issue as well. Skipping ahead here a little bit about the Mongols later on. This is one of those principles I was talking about that we'll talk about the Mongols, is that Temujin, a.k.a. Genghis Khan later, took absolute care of his soldiers. Absolute care of his soldiers. Moving ahead here, years later, it was a tradition that Genghis Khan started. No matter, every time they conquered somebody, everyone who served under him got a share of the spoils. Everyone, from the lowest to the highest. In fact, the very first thing he would do, if a Mongol soldier died in battle, the very first people who would get spoils of war is the family members of that soldier who died. So if you had a family and you died in battle, they got the spoils, they were taken care of. Now let's look at our modern world. Let's look at United States soldiers, for example. We have things, for example, called the Wounded Warrior Project. Fuck that shit. Now, before all my military friends jump on me, and I have lots of friends in the military, I am not saying don't support the troops. I'm saying fuck the Wounded Warrior Project because of this. Because the Wounded Warrior Project is a charity. Now, I am supporting the troops here, despite me saying fuck that. What I'm saying here is this. Why should our troops who go off and suffer, some of the most horrible conditions in war, come back with, post-traumatic stress disorder, why should our troops have to come back and rely on charity? It's a fucking disgrace. Our government does not take care of our soldiers. Bullshit. They come back, they can't find jobs, they can't find medical care. Bullshit. Temujin took care of his soldiers very, very, very well. And because of this, they were very, 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 very loyal to him. Unquestioning loyalty he had from his soldiers. We'll get into Mongol loyalty and stuff like that later. But spoiler alert, there's a priest who visits the Mongol Empire later on who basically says Mongol soldiers are more loyal to their khans than priests are to God. That is a huge statement. But it all stems from this. Temujin splitting the spoils between his men, taking care of his men. Now this also causes a big rift because, of course, the average men are very, very, they like Temujin, obviously. And some people from Jamuka's camp even start to like Temujin. And as they're breaking camp after this conquering the Merkits, some of Jamuka's followers actually go off with Temujin. And this causes a rift. He rides as they're riding away, saying, "Why are you taking my men?" He's like, "I didn't take your men." And maybe they're riding on some horses, and he's like, "These are my horses you're taking." And Temujin's like, "I didn't tell them to come with me. They have their own free will." So this causes a rift between them. Now, long story short here, we'll skip over some events here, but eventually Jamuka and Temujin do wind up, these blood brothers do wind up becoming enemies. Jamuka does defeat Temujin. Now, it's interesting, most of the sources we have, there's only one really source we have about the Mongol history here. It's called The Secret History of the Mongols. And it was something that was kept from the outside world for many, many years. I'm not going to go into too many details here, but there is a gap missing in the secret history. No one knows what happened for sure. There was a Russian movie some years back called Mongol. There was a Russian interpretation that Temujin was taken prisoner again like he was as a child here. Some people say he went off into the mountains. Temujin, again, coming from a tribal background, very, very close to nature. No one knows here. Bottom line is there's a gap in the history missing. But he does come back. He's still allies with Toghrul Khan. They go and they start fight other tribes. They fight people from the Jurchen tribe. Again, I told you earlier at the beginning of this, the Jurchens were the tribal peoples who conquered all of northern China and formed the Jin dynasty. But Temujin again does another key thing he does here that changes everything, is he goes and he when he defeats an offshoot of the Jurchen tribe here, traditionally, like I said, this constant cycle of warfare and the steps. One tribe would attack another tribe. You'd maybe take their women or take their goods, whatever. Temujin does something completely different here. He goes and he defeats the Jurchen tribe. But what he does here, and this is another thing that was causing a rift between him and Jamuka earlier on, is again, Jamuka is an aristocrat, excuse me, if you want to say that. He comes from a wealthy background. He's like a feudalistic leader of other tribal peoples. Temujin, again, was taking care of his troops. Every average person was getting stuff. So when when Temujin goes and conquers this tribe, he assimilates this tribe into his own. He kills all the leaders, all the aristocrats. Think about that in our modern world. He goes and kills all the rich cocksuckers, the word I love to use for them. Kills all the rich cocksuckers. But then he assimilates all the average people into his tribe. Then he does something else here. He actually takes a Jurchen child and adopts him as a sign that he's assimilating this tribe into his own. So normally you would raid a tribe, you'd take their things, and be off. But no, he's not doing that. He's forming something greater here. He's forming the roots of something here. He actually takes a kid, and makes him, adopts him. Backing up here real quick, sorry, I'm backtracking here, but when Temujin was defeated by Jamuka, I forgot to tell you, this is kind of a key point here, is that Temujin tortured all the people Jamuka tortured all the people who had left him and even Temujin's followers. He had these huge cauldrons, and he boiled like so many people alive. And the reason why I'm mentioning this again is because I'm mentioning principles that made the Mongols great. I said they like to follow tradition. I told you again, Temujin took great care of his troops. And there's an image that the Mongols were torturers and murderers. But because of this event right here, next podcast I'm going to talk about the positives and negatives of the Mongols, and one of them would be the idea of torture and stuff like that. But the image of the Mongols being people who torture people is not exactly accurate, because after this event, after Temujin witnessed this torture, he actually abolishes torture. Okay? But again, as we can see here, though, when he conquers this Jurchen tribe, though, he can be very brutal. He kills all the leaders, all the head people, but he keeps all the average people alive. There's a quote here from a book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. And I'm going to quote this book a few times. If you ever want to learn more about the Mongols, a lot of stuff of what I'm saying in this podcast is in this book. It is the greatest book written about the Mongols I've ever read. Highly, highly recommend it. Non-fiction book, but it goes over the history of the Mongols. And when you're reading it, it reads like a novel. Very, very interesting. But anyway, quoted here is, the messages were clear to all their related clans on the steppe. To those who followed Temujin faithfully, there would be rewards and good treatment. To those who chose to attack him, he would show no mercy. So again, two sides of the Mongols. Yes, they were very, very brutal when they conquered people. We can see this even early on when he's conquering other tribes. But really, he only killed the leaders, the rich cocksuckers. The average people, he brought into his tribe. And again, he took care of his troops very, very well. All right, so at this time, Jamuka's also getting kind of strong. He's also been building up his power base. He's making Togrul Khan, or Togrul, aka the An Khan, a little bit nervous. So Togrul and Temujin, get together, and they actually fight and defeat Jamuka. But the one thing we're going to see about Jamuka here is he's very, very resilient. Every time he's defeated, he goes to another tribe and takes them over. He kills their leaders and becomes the leader of a new tribe. Jamuka is very, very resilient. So they actually defeat Jamuka. So Jamuka defeated Temujin years earlier. Now they come back together and they defeat Jamuka. So back and forth fighting we're seeing here. But now, another important thing here is that Togrul sends Temujin to fight the Tartars. And it's very, very interesting because if you noticed in the beginning of this, I gave you two quotes from Voltaire and from Geoffrey Chaucer. And both of them referred to Genghis Khan as a Tartar. And it's very interesting because if you look at history, for a long time, that's what people called, they referred to the Mongols as Tartars. It's interesting because there was actually a tribe here, I said Tartars, I meant to say Tatar is the actual name of the actual Mongolian tribe. But that Tatar got changed to Tartar because, skipping ahead here, when the Mongols were invading Europe many years later, people literally thought they were the horsemen of the apocalypse. And going back to Greek times, people referred to hell as Tartarus. So they called the Mongols Tartars. Kind of interesting thing here. But really, the Tatars were another tribe on the Mongolian steppe. And if you remember at the beginning of this, I said it was the Tatars who had poisoned Temujin's father. So he kind of had, maybe a little bit of grudge here against people who killed his father. So Togrul sends him on a mission to go fight the Tatars. Temujin destroys them. But once again, instead of just scattering his tribe, he brings them and assimilates them to his own power base. So now Temujin is gaining power. He's becoming very strong. And now Togrul Khan is getting nervous of him just like he was with Jamuka. But Temujin, I said earlier in the beginning of this as like a little psychological picture here, how Temujin murdered his own stepbrother, maybe he couldn't be dominated by another person, but really, Temujin was always loyal to Togrul. He never did anything to betray him. And this kind of makes me think of the movie Scarface, when Frank sends people to kill Tony Montana, and Tony catches him in the lie that he did it. He's like, I never betrayed you, Frank! I never fucked you! I may what I couldn't decide, but I never betrayed you, Frank! Anyway. So, that reminds me of the scene of Scarface, when Tony and Frank are sitting there. But same situation here. Temujin never betrayed Togrul Khan. In fact, at this time, he offers his first son, Jochi, to marry Togrul's daughter to strengthen their alliance. But again, was Jochi Temujin's real son or not? Who knows? And that was obviously something that people were aware of, and Togrul refuses the marriage between his daughter and Temujin's son. So not only does he refuse the marriage, but he also goes and tries to have Temujin killed, while at the same time forming an alliance with Jamuka. So, out of nowhere, there's a surprise attack. He goes and sends people to attack Temujin. He flees. He survives. But at this time, they're probably thinking Temujin's going to go fleeing with his legs, with his tail between his legs. But that's not what happens. Temujin comes back and immediately counterattacks, fights Togrul Khan and Jamuka, defeats them, and scatters their army. So now they flee west into the lands of another tribe called the Naiman. And the Naiman, very, very powerful tribe. More powerful than any other tribe that Temujin or Jamuka or any of them have faced. Jamuka flees, and so does Togrul Khan. Now again, on the Mongolian steppe, I told you they were tribal peoples, but there was an element of feudalism here. Togrul Khan, Jamuka are both rich cocksuckers. They're people of privilege. They don't usually kill tribal leaders. It's the same way you can think of, in a Western perspective, of medieval Europe, how sometimes a lord might kill another lord in battle, but other times it was considered uncivilized to kill a knight. Common foot soldiers were cannon fodder. You could run over them, they'd mean nothing. But people, the rich people, you couldn't kill them. Well, as Togrul Khan's fleeing to the Naiman, they didn't recognize who he was, and they kill him because they don't know who he is. This, of course, is a pretext for Jamuka. Again, I told you he constantly comes back from the dead, relatively speaking anyway, not literally. Jamuka, because they killed Togrul Khan, he actually goes and overthrows the leader of the Naiman. So now he takes over this powerful, powerful tribe, the Naiman. And this sets up this huge epic battle, the final battle between Jamuka and Temujin. Of course, Temujin wins, and he's greatly outnumbered and stuff like that. But it is at this time that Temujin makes the Mongol military machine that would go and conquer the world. Just as a quick background, it's so interesting when you look at the Mongols, and this is something that's going to kind of flow over into maybe the next podcast, is that Mongol warriors were not officially trained. And what I mean by that is if you look at like the Romans or something like that, it had like military academies and established military histories. Of course, steppe people, again, I've said it, were very militaristic, but there was no like official training ground. No one showed Temujin how to become a general. It's one of the greatest military, well, his generals, of course, were amazing as well, but no one taught him how to wage war. All the lessons that he learned by fighting other peoples, by seeing what would work. And this is going to carry on again next podcast when we talk about the Mongol conquest, but quick little preview here. No one taught him how to wage war. Taught it all to himself. Really, really crazy, and it's absolutely mind-blowing when you think about it. But anyway, at this time is when he starts really making his men a disciplined fighting force. And one of the principles, one of the reasons why we're talking about the Mongols again is because of the tribal system. And the idea of what I said is that how most people think a tribal system can only work on a small scale. One of the things the Mongols do is they show how something done on a small scale can also be done simultaneously on a large scale, and no more so in the organization of their military. Again, this is skipping ahead a little bit here, but the Mongol military was formed on traditions that were around since the days of the Huns, which people think might have come from the steppes of Mongolia or somewhere similar. And that is their military units were established in groups of 10. The smallest group was a group of 10. You take 10 groups of 10, and you have 100. 10 groups of 100, you have 1,000. 10 groups of 1,000, you have 10,000. The organization of the army never changed, whether you were on a small scale or a large scale. It was always the same. And there's something this is actually a very important principle to me in lots of things in general, is the idea that people think that things done on the small scale can't be done on a large scale. And again, looking at the bigger picture here of a tribal system, yes, it can work on a smaller scale. You run a large number of people the same way you run a small scale people, and yes, it can work. And in fact, in the very famous book, Sun Tzu's Art of War, he literally says how the running, paraphrasing, but basically he says that the running of the many is the same as the running of the few. And of course, there are some practical implementations of that, of supply trains and stuff like that if you're talking about war. But the point is, in principles can be applied on a small scale, on a large scale, or on a large scale. And that's why I try teaching people principles a lot. But anyway, moving along and all that stuff here. At this time, Temujin was building the fighting force again that would conquer the world. Very, very highly disciplined military force. And another principle I want to point out here that made the Mongols so great is something that can be applied to the world scale today is emphasis on what's more important. What is more important? The good of the group, of a large group as a whole, or the group of an individual? And stereotypically speaking, traditionally, Western cultures like the United States and European countries put so much emphasis on the individual, where Asian cultures like China, or I don't know, maybe so much Japan right now, but but you can use China as an example, had much more emphasis on the greater good. So in one society, the lives of individuals don't matter as much. In the other society, the value of individuals matters too much. But right here, another key principle within the Mongols, at least under Genghis Khan, is they had this very, very perfect balance between individualism and the good of the group as a whole. And you can see this in the organization of Mongol military, because nowhere in any other military in the world is there such a balance. Because in a small group for 10, for example, every individual in that small group had a task. Everyone was of value. And yet that small group of 10 would then mix with another group of 10 and make the group of 10,000. And you see my point here. So again, the point I'm trying to press here, small scale, large scale, doesn't matter. Mongols mixed, the individual with the group in such a perfect way. And because of that, because every individual had a value, but also they were part of the greater whole, it was this well-oiled fighting machine here, highly, highly disciplined. It was at this time that Temujin took this highly disciplined army and went and defeated Jamukha in this epic battle. Now, the end of the story here is Jamukha, when he was defeated, his own people turned him into Temujin. But this brings us to the most important quality of the Mongols. The most important was the idea of loyalty. There was nothing more important in Temujin's life than loyalty. And actually, one thing I forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about a system of giving out spoils of war to all of his troops was another idea called meritocracy. And if you're not familiar with what meritocracy is, it's basically this. You advance in society based on your merit. Now, again, there was a slight feudal system on the Mongolian steppes, just like there was a feudal system back in medieval Europe, just as I would argue in last podcast how the oligarchs, aka the rich cocksuckers, are running the world right now. Again, I'm showing you principles that apply for the Mongols and also in our modern world. And one of them is the idea that in the world we know, it cannot be argued that our world is owned by a few individuals. It could be argued that we are living in a monetary feudalistic system in the world today, but that's going to be left for another podcast. But those rich cocksuckers, those rich motherfuckers were afraid of Temujin because he destroyed these old caste systems. Meritocracy, it doesn't matter. And this is an idea we kind of have in the United States. Maybe when our country was first formed, people would still want to live the American dream. I would argue it's all a bunch of bullshit in our modern world, but that's, again, another podcast. And that's the idea that we have the same idea in the United States. Doesn't matter where you came from. People who left Europe to come over here as colonists for a new start, new beginning. Anyone can build themselves up. The same noble principle is here with the Mongols under Genghis Khan. Anyone, no matter what your background, can rise to power or rise to a prominent role. Meritocracy. If you have the ability, if you prove yourself, you will advance. And one of the a really good story in this regard is one time when Temujin was fighting another tribe, I forget exactly where it was, but it was before he united all the Mongols, a guy from an enemy side, and this guy would actually go on to become one of Temujin's greatest generals. I forget his name off the top of my head, but he shot an arrow that just barely missed Temujin. It cut his neck open. And of course, you don't in the midst of the battle, you don't know exactly who fired it, but they know where it came from. They were chasing the enemy down. They surrounded them. And Temujin said, "One of you shot an arrow that almost killed my horse. Who was it?" And this man stepped forward and did not lie. He said, "I didn't shoot your horse. I shot you." And he's like, "If you let me follow you, I'll be your servant. I'll serve you for life." And this guy became one of Temujin's most famous generals. Temujin very much admired, courage, the way the guy stood up like that. So again, meritocracy. Anyone can rise. Meritocracy and loyalty. So when these people turn in Jamuka, going back to the story, his own followers turn him in, Temujin has them executed because they betrayed their master. And there's kind of a moment here you see, I was going over the background on Temujin here, his rise to power, all the principles that made him great, meritocracy, loyalty, keeping to the traditions, but all great leaders have to have a polarizing figure. For example, you had Julius Caesar and Pompey. You have Wellington and Napoleon at Waterloo. In feudal Japan, well, not feudal Japan, but the Sengoku period of Japan, you have Takeda Shingen and Takeda. My goodness, Uesugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen. Excuse me, I mixed their names up for a second there. But anyway, you have all these. Everyone has like a rival or something. Someone who makes them great. And Temujin's rival was Jamuka, without a doubt. But even though they were arch enemies, they were also Anda. They were also blood brothers. Now, there's a moment here where Temujin, he wants to forgive Jamuka. He says, "Come back to me, join me. We can become one. We can reconcile everything." But another thing that I admire about steppe peoples is their honesty. Is that if you look, for example, again, I mentioned Julius Caesar. When he let all of his enemies live in the Senate after he took over Rome, what did they do? They put on smiley faces, they acted like they were cool, and then he wound up stabbing him to death in the back. Jamuka could do the same thing. He could pretend like he's Temujin's friend, betray him, but no. He's honest. He says, just as there is one sun in the sky, there should be one ruler on earth. So Temujin has him killed. Again, keeping with tradition, you can't spill the blood of a noble, if you want to say that, aka noble. Again, Jamuka came from this aristocratic background. So I think he's strangled or whatever the case may be, but it doesn't really matter. Bottom line is he's killed. It's at this point that they hold a meeting called a Kirolti. The Kirolti is when all the heads of the tribes get together. It's at this point that Temujin is elected the Great Khan. This is when he becomes Genghis Khan. This is when he unites all the people who live in felt tents, all the people who lived in the yurts. It is here that he rises to power. Okay, so just a quick review of all the things we talked about. Again, meritocracy, it doesn't matter where you are, you can rise to power. Loyalty, keeping to traditions, taking care of his soldiers, all these things made Temujin great. But there's also some other things he does now. Again, these images of the Mongols being people who go out, wild barbarians, raping women, not so true. Another thing Genghis Khan does when he gets to power. First, I mentioned earlier that story how Jamuka tortured people. He abolishes torture. He also abolishes the taking of another man's wife. Again, his mother was kidnapped. His wife was kidnapped. So Genghis Khan being this raping pillager, not so true. He abolishes the taking of women. And another thing that makes the Mongols so great is their adaptability. Again, they didn't make things themselves. They didn't make fine silks. They didn't make metal. They got these things from trading with other people. But they would adapt to other people's way of life. And this is going to lead us in the next podcast when we get to the next podcast. We'll start from Genghis Khan uniting all the Mongol peoples to a quick background on the Mongol conquest. We'll then go over the positives and negatives of the Mongol Empire. All right, so that finishes up this one. So next podcast, part 2, we'll leave off with Genghis Khan, the Khan man starting the Mongol Empire.